The Jetsons, Charlton, Issue 9. Jane tells Elroy he's wanted on the space phone where an alien from the magically terraformed Neptune wants him to visit him for the weekend. But why did someone from so far away still go to Elroy's school? The only way they'd meet. It wouldn't be very likely that he'd be allowed to do this. But Jane agrees anyways. She doesn't think George would mind. But considering that she's never on the same wavelength as him, she had no reason to say that. It only makes sense if she knew he'd mind and just didn't care. Elroy thanks her for her concern about him, and the thing automatically trying to get him to Neptune breaks down. If that's possible, I hope there's a way for him to contact his parents if it does, because otherwise it was very reckless of Jane to let him go in that thing. If there'd realistically be no way for him to get anywhere and be stuck in space if it breaks. Extremely conveniently for him, a circus spaceship approaches him and he gets told that the driver's on his way to Saturn and willing to pick him up. I have to assume the driver's talking to him via radio, and that despite the ringed planet in the background, they aren't in space because Elroy can still talk and breathe. After all, he is on a cloud, so it's clearly a magically solid cloud made by a witch. Some horrible-looking circus clowns try to entertain Elroy. There's no reason one of them would jump on his head. And that he wouldn't be hurt and would be smiling afterwards. He's offered a cloud cone and gets shocked by it. He runs away and steps on someone's foot, and somehow he gets sprayed by water into an elephant, who throws him away with his trunk insulting him as a brat when it's obvious that it wasn't his fault. He must be able to talk to him because either he's genetically engineered or an alien. This would make more sense if it was just a dream. Elroy bounces off something and swings into a cannon to get launched down a giraffe's neck, and he gets sent through a burning ring. The story actually ends there. Then George complains about Rosie squeaking when he oiled her last week. Jane calls him out on insulting her unnecessarily. He naturally ignores her and oils her, and finds out that somehow there was a pet mouse in her. In the next story, George's family is upset at people carrying Rosie away on a stretcher to take her to the junkyard after one of them turned her off. George is somehow wondering what they're all crying about, and says he ordered a more efficient robot for the house. If they were entirely logical, they'd be happy. But they couldn't be because it's going to get Rosie sent to the junkyard when she could have easily been sent to another family. Even if the show does make a big deal out of how she's obsolete, but for a low enough price, that wouldn't be an excuse for her to never get another job. Astro bites him, which in a normal family would get him rightfully kicked out of there. A muzzle would be the only way to keep Astro from doing that to him again, but I can understand Jane's refusal to let him do that because it'd look abusive and make him look pitiful. His family's too cartoonishly domineering over him for him to simply get rid of him without them all throwing a tantrum until he'd cave. He tells Elroy to keep Astro tied up in the backyard, but there's no proof he goes on to do that. George gets excited over a robot in a box called Jason that's programmed for 3 times as many activities as Rosie. Somehow, right after he was activated, he already knows that George's checkbook is a mess full of blunders. There's also no reason the robot would insult him instead of being programmed for politeness. Wouldn't you think he'd be fired for insulting him and not do it? This is just there in a pathetic attempt to justify him getting Rosie back, which clearly didn't need to happen, because all his family would have to do is whine and be mean to him for long enough. Somehow, Jason plans to throw out an article of furniture with no real excuse for it, as well as the photos on the wall of George. Somehow, George doesn't tell him not to. He says yes when he tells him that after disposing of those old things, he needs to get rid of the shoes and hat. Somehow, Jason expects him to do something because he's already exhausted when he did basically nothing. This is a really lame story. He shuts him off, the art quality degrades pathetically, and it turns out Rosie's back because Jane caught up with the robot removers outside. But that was a panel after George complained. and they were in the house the whole time. And Rosie tells George that he can do the dishes. I don't know why the artist was allowed to draw like this. In the next story, somehow Sun was able to make it so that tomorrow's news would be shown on Elroy's TV. It's an interesting idea for a plot, but I hate that the story expects me to believe he did it by redesigning the circuitry with his hands alone, when clearly only the magic he showed earlier would accomplish this. Instead, Elroy's got a screwdriver, as if there was any chance science could do this. He tells Elroy not to change the setting of those knobs. Why does he think they won't be changed in a house with an entire family? Elroy had no reason to think George would watch the news if he knows he always watches something else. George gets confused that the TV show he's seeing is the next day's episode. How in the world are TV shows of television serials releasing new episodes every day? And I hate that he says some's imaginary. He's met aliens before and he would have been shown him, so why in the world does that keep coming up in the dialogue? Elroy tells him he could game the stock market with this machine, but George just screws it up. And the story ends surprisingly quickly after that. How did he not believe he has a friend from Mars when Jane believed he had a friend from Neptune? In the next story, Jane tells Elroy not to ruin his appetite for supper, and he holds the sandwich over his head while Robot Claw from the ceiling is facing it. And some other Robot Claws serve the family some meals because Rosie pressed a button. As Elroy says, he was reading about the earlier methods of preparing meals in ancient history. Why would kids be taught about ancient history? There's no way Jane would think people always got food this way. Elroy offers to get his recipe book from his room that he got from the library, and she gets shown it. There's no way Jane only knows what an egg is because she saw it in a museum. I guess she means a dinosaur egg was in a museum. There's still chicken farmers who see eggs every day. Even in the show, she knew what an egg was. She doesn't recognize flour, and I guess she assumes it's a misspelling of flour. George is smart for once by knowing that all those ingredients are at the Unusual Materials Supply Bureau, and by suggesting that the chocolate cake recipe would be delicious. Somehow, Rosie thinks nobody could make anything edible from those cookie recipes. She's a robot, so she's supposed to be logical and smart, and usually that's how she is. They get the ingredients with someone at the store thinking they're gonna do government research with them, while specifying that they bought real chicken eggs. Elroy tells George that according to the pictures in the cookbook, you've got to wear an apron when making a cake. Why would a kid call pictures illustrations? This was all for a gag where Astro is wearing the apron like a human. How does George drop the egg by accident? Jane expects me to believe that every time George comes into the kitchen, he makes it a mess. Astro ends up taking a bite of the chocolate cake. I held off on saying this when he was wearing the apron, but now I really have to. It's a very good thing the comic explained that he's not just a real dog, but also a descendant of aliens, so that can hand wave away why chocolate doesn't kill him. Or maybe old dog breeds were genetically engineered generation by generation to not die from chocolate. Which is such a common thing, and dogs are so cared about that there's no way people would be opposed to that. Rosie decides to order another cake with a single lever switch and gets it instantly. George and Elroy don't know that they're eating a different cake, and George wonders why Astro hasn't touched the piece of cake in his dog bowl. Why isn't he giving it a chance? It'd make more sense if he did eat a bite of it, and didn't finish it because he knew the real cake tasted better. Hence why ends the story making another cake the real way. Jane at least has an excuse for telling him they won't make any more cakes here because she was shown to hate how it messed up her kitchen. But she's so unbelievably selfish, especially since Rosie's there to clean it up for her. So she really has no reason to care if the kitchen gets messed up for a little bit. What she should be saying to make sense immediately is that they could just press a button to get a cake right away, which is a smarter decision for being faster and more reliable. If Astro can do what humans can, we'll have to assume that the reason he doesn't just write stuff down to communicate and tell her that the real cake tasted better is that he wasn't taught how to read and write. I'm glad the story ended without George and Elroy finding out they were fooled, because it makes what Astro did harmless. I'm also really relieved that the cake was baked perfectly. It'd be too predictable a joke for it to be baked badly. And it'd make no sense because they followed the recipe perfectly. But still, I was looking forward to them following the recipe incorrectly for actually believable reasons from their inexperience with cooking. It'd be a good way to teach people about those rookie mistakes at least. Instead, it was a story with no genuine conflict where they just make a cake normally with no problem. In the next story, at least Jane tries to be nice to George by complimenting his gray hair. But I don't know why the artist allowed to get away with making your eyes look like that. Even if it is a good idea, because at least one of Elroy's parents should have his eyes. But it's too late now, and I never liked that look in the first place. Because George called himself old because of one gray hair, she concludes that today's his birthday and tells her family that, without checking the calendar first to confirm her wild assumption when any day could have him say that. Judy suggests throwing a birthday party, and Rosie doesn't look forward to cleaning up a mess because she's smart. Jane tells Elroy to run out and buy a gift for his dad, without telling him what to buy, and he runs away without holding any money heading for a door. And he won't be supervised the whole time somehow. She puts a recipe in a computer expecting it to make the cake, because apparently she can do that, because this is a different universe from another story. The machine's stuck, so the story ends with George getting a huge amount of birthday cakes. And he says, a separate cake for every year. That's rubbing it in. So it really is his birthday. It makes more sense that she jumped to the conclusion then, because she just remembered what day it was. He's not excited because he knows he can't eat that many cakes, and they can't store them all without them going bad. In the next story, a bowl gets sent to Jane somehow, as she says the machines aren't working right, with a vacuum running after Elroy and Judy's hair looking messy. How did her hair get right back to normal right away? Rosie drops the plates, and Jane begs for George's help doing something about all of the appliances. He says he rented a cottage in the wilderness for the summer and tells his family to start packing to leave at once. That doesn't do anything to fix the machines. I was wondering if we'd find out why they weren't working right, like someone sabotaged all of them. Jane doesn't have to insult his hat. Why is only Judy in a bathing suit? He drives towards the National Wilderness area and gets told of mosquitoes on his nose. As I wonder why they weren't all wiped out in the future, he hits his own nose and tells Astro to keep away from him because he needs a bath. Judy thankfully thinks it's fun to cook the normal way. I guess the only reason Jane thinks she likes living this way when it's harder to clean is that not only has she just started, but she's just glad she isn't being chased by malfunctioning gadgets that throw stuff at her. Somehow nobody freaks out at Elroy carrying a snake that looks stoned. They'd be getting hurt by it. I have to assume snakes were genetically engineered to not hurt people in the future. That their food was laced with nanobots to reprogram them all. Why does Judy care enough to tell him to wash his hands for dinner? Someone tells Jane to tell George he should read the keep out sign, and thankfully lets him off with a warning. Jane thanks him for bringing him home because he would have gotten lost trying to go hunting. I feel like there was no excuse for there being a no trespassing area in the National Wilderness area. They were supposed to have this property to themselves. George should have just gone to another planet. At least Judy and Jane are happy. Jane says it's a restful life, and the story surprisingly ends there, with George saying it's not restful because he had to chop up firewood. I guess they missed Rosie, and that's why they went back home. In the next story, George yells at Astro to get out of his chair and threatens to lock him in the cellar somehow, even though they don't have one. And since he's lived in the house for quite some time, it's a miracle he even said this. Even if I can sort of make sense of it by assuming that he said that from having a cellar in his first house. He's lucky to get back in his chair, and eventually goes to sleep in it, while Astro watches TV, which tells a story about Cassie, the wonder dog of Uranus, which is the dog star apparently, when clearly a planet isn't a star. So Uranus is a star in this universe, far away from the Earth. Then there's some panels with cloud-like shapes implying that just when the story got more interesting, it's only because it was a dream about aliens wanting to kidnap Astro for being their true king. Good thing it tells me it's a dream right away so that it makes sense that nothing makes sense. George doesn't believe Elroy when he tells him they're being invaded. One of the alien dogs threatens George with a ray gun, trying to force him to get Astro in his chair successfully, calling it his throne. The dreaming stops with Astro sitting on him, and Jane says she'll fix everything. Finally, they have a second armchair. They should have had that a long time ago because Astro would have started trying to sit in the chair much earlier. The first story was about Elroy's little spaceship breaking down on its way to Neptune so that he can't visit his friend. Which makes me wonder why Jane sent him off in it, if there's nothing he can do if it breaks down. So miraculously, a spaceship that was headed for a circus picks him up, and then Elroy goes through a bunch of unlikely slapstick and mishaps related to the circus, like him getting sprayed with water completely nonsensically, after getting shocked by a thundercloud ice cream cone because these guys are jerks. At least it was interesting to look at and had a lot happening, even if it was too unlikely. The second story had the replacement for Rosie be forced by the writer to want to get rid of the stuff in George's house for being outdated and be lazy, to get George to shut him off and want Rosie back, when clearly he wouldn't be able to act like this. George would have wanted her back anyways because all his family would do is bitch and moan until they got their way. It's not like George was entirely the good guy either, because he shouldn't have thought he'd be allowed to get her sent to the junkyard and replaced when they all grew attached to her. But I bet maids still get replaced in households with families in real life, because it just seems unlikely that they'd have perfect job security. The third story is Elroy talked George into helping him bake a cake because he somehow got taught ancient history and got a hold of a cookbook in the library. So it's great that George decided to humor his kid and do something with them, even if it was a waste of their time otherwise. Especially since Astro ate the cake anyways. It's relatable of them to try to cook for the first time, so I found it easier than ever to get invested. It's too bad they didn't mess up making the cake. It could have shown how amateurs would realistically mess up following a real recipe, and that would have created actual conflict, and be educational. But instead they bake a cake with no problem other than somehow dropping an egg on the floor. Is it even realistic that two complete newbies could make a good cake on the first try? Astro didn't hate it, but I assume this is the first cake he's ever eaten. Thank goodness George and Elroy never find out that they ended up eating a different cake, or that would have been a terrible ending. The actual plot's too mundane for its own good. So it's good that the story keeps emphasizing that it's the future by explaining that old-fashioned cooking is gone, and people don't know why they're getting ingredients that are only used for that, from a store that conveniently keeps them around for no explained reason. Then there's a story where Jane tries to get George's birthday celebrated, only for the machine that makes cakes from cake ingredients that suddenly exists to get stuck making cakes. And somehow it makes a ton of cakes out of just the ingredients for one cake, because I guess it was made by a witch. It was worth it for the funny panel at the end, but otherwise it was a boring, mundane plot. And then there's the story where because the cooking and cleaning appliances are dangerously malfunctioning, which we sadly never learn the answer to for an exciting story, George decides to go to a cabin in the National Wilderness area, and his family conveniently enjoys the more old-fashioned way of cooking and cleaning because it's safer, I guess. You'd think we'd get to see them complain about getting bored without TV or entertainment, and having to work harder. But the story ends too quickly, with George not liking having to chop wood. Other than the first page, it was too mundane, but I'm glad the tone was lighthearted after that. All these stories ended too quickly, but it's much better than a story dragging on too long. It's better than one story the whole issue with only one sentence's worth of a plot. Finally, there's a story where Astro and George feud over who gets to sit in the living room chair. The only way this plot takes advantage of the sci-fi environment is because this is only happening because Astro is a descendant of aliens. Otherwise, it's way too mundane and boring. And I like that the dream George has is also a subtle reference to that, complete with the aliens looking like Sirius stones. I just wish they were called that instead of Uranus being called the Dog Star somehow. But it was just a dream based on a show we watched, so it made sense. I'm glad its ending had the common sense solution for a happy ending.